Welcome to our New Year's episode. Welcome to We're Not Fine.
Cheers.
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 This week, we're going to talk about, do you fight fairly? Are you a fair fighter or do you fight dirty?
This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and guests. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. This podcast also does not establish a standard of care, doctor-patient, or client relationship. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. And because each person is so unique, all listeners are encouraged to connect with counseling and medical professionals for assistance with their personal journey. All people, places, and scenarios mentioned in the podcast have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved.
Welcome to We're Not Fine. I'm Dr. Talia Jackson.
And I'm Doug Jensen. We thank you for listening every week to our deep and thought-provoking conversations about relationships.
Doug, tell me the truth. Do you fight fair?
Whether you fight fair?
No, whether you fight fair, because we're going to own our own stuff. And today you have to talk about if you're fighting fair. And then I will own mine.
I do sometimes and not other times. That's the truth.
God, that's my truth too.
I don't love it.
But when don't you fight fair?
I don't fight fair when I'm feeling attacked maybe, or I'm drinking. That for sure is the case, which we kind of talked about, like how that causes inhibition of our ability to behave in a civil way that might be more socially appropriate. Yeah, I don't know. So I would say sometimes yes and sometimes not. If I also don't feel heard after trying like 3 times, I'll be like, I don't know. I think I resort to other ways of communicating, and one of them is not great. I mean, a few of them are not great, but yeah, I do both. Do you?
Yeah, I do both as well. And I think you're exactly right, which is kind of an interesting concept. It's sort of like if I feel caught off guard or attacked, then it's really hard for me to get into my really mature, intentional, and thoughtful mode about, this person is airing a grievance, which they have every right to do because that's what that's what people do in healthy relationships. And it's a bid for connection. But it's almost like I need to be in the right headspace. So maybe even just to put out there before we dive into all of the different factors of what fighting fairly or fighting dirty is, maybe it's a good idea to just give your partner a little bit of a heads up that like, hey, can we chat about something? Or I was feeling hurt about something. Can we make time so that you have a much better chance of having it land right?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it's not just partner, right? It's friends, it's family, it's coworkers, it's all of these things. I will say the other thing that I think is relevant to talk about is our family of origin, right? Like it's one of the things that I value a great deal when I'm assessing a client system, because I want to know how conversations occurred with the people that were role models for you, right? If you did not get any sort of guide on how to be thoughtful and respectful and calm in a relationship conversation, whatever it might be, then you're likely not with those skills necessary to do that, because you need to be able to be, your nervous system needs to be calm. Your ability to be thoughtful needs to be there. So,
I think that's really beautiful. And it's classic psychodynamic, right? Like
sure.
The way we show up in our relationships now has everything to do with the way our nervous system became wired in our early childhood, which has everything to do with maybe the way our guardians, caregivers, parents aired grievances or listened to yours, which, we have a couple really amazing episodes coming on, what happens if one of our parents was emotionally abusive and how we end up relating to people because of it. But this particular episode, we're just tackling, do you fight fairly? And what does that mean and how we can fight better?
We're going to go through some scenarios where, you're not fighting fair. And the first one that we want to tackle is like when you're fighting to win. So fighting to win. And here's the interesting thing about this. If you get into this spat and your intensity is probably a little bit high because you're just trying to get that other person to hear you or agree with you, that is not an effective communication or fighting style, right? So what we're looking for in a situation like that is to really just be curious. That's a word that triggers some people. Be curious about what the other person thinks about it. You don't have to be right. You might end up with the person agreeing with you that you're right. Like Talia oftentimes will agree with me after she's had some time to think about her responses. But the thing that I'm struck by is if you take some time and you really think through it, like that's the goal here. So fighting to win just kind of means that you want that other person to agree with you. And that's not fair because that person is a separate person.
So if I had to pick one of all of these that I am most guilty of, it is that one. And that was the style that I learned in my childhood too. It's like fight to the death. But for me, what it felt like was you can't admit fault. So I didn't need anyone to agree with me. And this is where, like, I still, at almost 50 years old, I try so hard to be like, okay, I know the relationship is more important than being right, but I don't need to be right as much as I need to not be at fault. Like my wiring is set up so that if I admitted I did something wrong, the world would end, which of course, like when you're not triggered and you're not traumatized, you know, all of this is unreasonable. But yeah, that is such an important one to actually calm your nervous system down enough to listen.
And I can't tell you how many couples have come in and I'll say, did you apologize for that? Because there'll be some grievance, right? And I'm sorry is a very hard thing for some people to do because you assume that it makes you so vulnerable and you're going to something bad is going to happen. It's quite the opposite. It is so powerful and such a sign of strength in an individual to be able to take responsibility for their part.
But only if you are in an emotionally safe moment with an emotionally safe person, because otherwise it is very vulnerable.
I agree with that, but I'm going to say do it anyway.
But that's right? The whole point of this is like, if you find when we're talking about, do you fight dirty? If you're like, oh shit, that's me. We love you. We get it. We're all just a squirrel trying to get a nut, trying to figure out how to be mature in our relationships. But just what Doug said at the beginning that I loved so much is like, okay, let's acknowledge we don't fight fair and we can learn how to do better. So that's the point of therapy. It's the point of everything. And just we're doing our work. Okay, next one, bringing up the past, which is like a classic, really unpleasant move of well, you did all of these things and you always, but that's not the always and never. But if you're bringing up stuff from the past that isn't relevant to this one moment in time, you will immediately trigger defensiveness.
But here's the thing about that. Like, I feel like when people bring up the past, it means that they've not been heard. It's not been resolved. It's not been understood. And I think for people who end up bringing things up over and over and over, it hasn't reached a point where people necessarily have felt like the other person understands their circumstance or their position. So I would say it's kind of, when things keep getting brought up from the past, I think it's a sign maybe, ask the other person if they keep bringing it up, like, have we not talked about that to the extent that it is resolved for you? Like, check in with that person because you know what I mean? Like, I think there's a point at which you're just not resolved on that issue. I
mean, I agree, but I feel like that should be a completely separate thing because it's detracting from the issue at hand that someone's trying to discuss now. You know what I mean?
I know. I think it depends. I mean, there's a part of me that thinks sometimes people bring up things from the past that are relevant to the current circumstance, especially if it's a recurrent issue, right?
Right.
And so there's something just, if this, and it kind of brings up the same issue that keeps coming up as well.
Like it's a pattern.
If there's a pattern.
Okay, that makes sense.
But it also, I agree with you, like people might bring up the past in ways that are not necessarily relevant to the conversation,
So maybe watch that.
I agree. Watch it carefully.
Watch it. We're watching you.
Another rotten way of fighting is shutting down. A lot of therapists call it stonewalling, which kind of just means that you're not willing to talk about it.
Or not able.
Not able. And when you're not able and your nervous system is activated and you're reactive at the time and you just cannot talk, it is okay to ask for time. Mm-hmm. It is okay to say, I want to hear your side of this. I want to have this conversation, but I just got home from work. I haven't eaten yet and I'm hangry. Or
that's right.
I'm under a lot of stress and I just cannot have that conversation right now. Can we table it until later? I will bring it up
later. That's right.
Because the person who leaves it,
the best.
has to take the responsibility to bring it back onto the table.
Because otherwise it feels like someone is abandoning you in a really vulnerable moment. But yeah, I do think that sometimes it's a nervous system issue that some people just shut down and short circuit when their nervous system is activated. But also, again, like Doug said, these are skills, right? Just because you've had whatever childhood and never learned the skills, it's not too late. Like, now's the time. Getting defensive. I mean, that's literally what we just talked about. Oh, this one is such a toughie. I will watch some couples in my office, and I will be so amazed by people who aren't getting defensive. Like, I notice when people don't get defensive, and then I go home and I'm like, Rob, I'm so sorry. I still need to work on this, because I'm like, wow, they're new to therapy, and somehow they were just like, oh, thank you for bringing this up. Thank you for your honesty. And I'm like, wow, is that how you do it? Doug.
It is, and I think we're not going to please everyone. And by the way, when somebody brings up something that triggers you into a defensive stance, oftentimes it feels like an attack, or we think maybe they don't like us anymore, or they are trying to tell us something that is going to end the relationship. Stay in the moment, folks, and just kind of hear them out and ask the questions, ask any clarifying questions that you need about that. But I think people fear that blame and shame kind of right. Gets triggered in our systems. And so we got to make sure that we hear people for what they're saying and not make assumptions based on our own insecurities or inadequacies or doubts.
Beautifully said. And I will tell you, after, probably this combined 50 years of work we've done with couples, it is very rare that if someone is calling someone out on a behavior that's hurtful, that what they're actually saying is you're a bad person and you're always wrong. And what, the way that you are in the world sucks. And that's where our brains might go when we're feeling defensive, but that's never what it is.
And it's interesting, Talia, one of the things we did not say at the beginning of this conversation is that fights are inevitable. Like, anytime you're in a real relationship, like, there's a lot of people who are like, we've never fought. And I always think,
I worry.
Uh-oh.
I know, me too. I'm like, that's not a good sign.
Like, there's no question there's stuff that did not work in the relationship, because no relationship is flawless. No relationship is without its differences. And inevitably, they're going to come up. And how you handle that matters. That kind of goes to this don't drop the rope comment that I've made before. Like, that's a big issue for me in therapy, and a key way that I look at this. You can't, if you're in a relationship and you want it to work, you can't drop your end of the rope. You have to stay present. You have to stay connected, even if it's hard. And again, you get to take time to not be in that defensive stance. Next bad idea, personal attacks. Ooh.
Yes.
So this is rough. This is where accusations come into place. Like, if you're accusing your person of you always, and always and never are triggers here. Like, when people get black and white about their thinking and they think you always do this, you never do this, you always do this. Those are naturally going to evoke some defensiveness, because it's never the case. Like, I think I just used the word never.
No,
like, it's really never the case that something is that black and white.
That's right.
So when we start getting into a personal attacks, boy, John Gottman talks about contempt.
Yes.
And I think it kind of comes up in this conversation for me about, if you're at that place where you look at someone in your life a certain way, you might have to decide whether they're good for you or they're not good for you. If there's something that kind of continues to go on and you feel like you need to make those small, I want to say, immature attacks.
I really love that, because basically what you're saying is maybe the issue isn't just that you are fighting dirty and making personal attacks. Maybe it is actually true that you're starting to build some contempt, or you see these character flaws, like you're so selfish, or you only think about your whatever it is. That maybe if you are truly seeing your partner like that, we've got bigger issues.
Yeah, I also think, Talia, that it kind of brings up to me, like, if you're in a chronically toxic, or the person is in therapy kind of doing their work and they're not there yet. Like, if you've done your work and that other person isn't there, it's really easy to get frustrated and overwhelmed and go after them. And they're like, and go after even the fact that they're not mature, or they haven't done their work. I've had couples fight about that, where, one person has been in therapy for a while. They might have just started their relationship, or the other person hasn't done it. And it's really easy to make personal attacks like, I've been in therapy, you haven't, or
right.
Right. So there's a lot of different elements here.
Yeah, good things to watch out for. This next one is a little bit related to don't fight to win, but it's more listen to understand and don't be in your head thinking about your next rebuttal. And so what would that even look like? It would look different, right? Because you're not on the defense and you're not just like waiting to fight back, but you're actually trying to understand. There's something about that is really hard for most people to do. Is when you're fighting, you aren't necessarily even thinking that the goal is, I want to understand my partner so that I can find my way back to them as soon as possible. That is like the beautiful reframe I think we're trying to put out there.
Yeah, I think we're moving into like the adaptive ways of fighting, right? Like I think, and I've referenced this before, Dr. Bill Bradshaw, one of my absolute mentors and favorite people who was in my graduate program as an instructor. I remember I was so in my head. I've referenced this on the podcast before. It's been 30 years. I've been practicing for 30 years now. But the reality is in grad school, I remember like we were doing some role plays and we were like practicing being therapists. And I was so in my head. I wanted to make sure I asked the right questions. I was constantly like not listening really. And all he said was, your job is to listen and try to understand. And I will never,
and
ever,
you're like,
ever.
What?
Well, like I bowed.
I know.
And I still do. Like it was the most amazing, simple concept. And I use it in my couples therapy a lot. Like listen and try to understand, what are you hearing them say? Which, we talk about paraphrasing, we talk about all those things. But that's, when you talk about listening to understand, that's the goal.
That's
like you may not agree with that person. You may be just dumbfounded with how different your realities were about the same circumstance. But it doesn't matter. What you're doing is trying to understand where that person is coming from.
Right.
And it might even help to mirror that and say, so what I hear you saying is this. Helpful thing. Next positive thing is to express yourself, but don't attack. And the easiest way to do that is start with an I feel statement. Seems so basic and elementary, like 101, communication 101. But the reality is if you take any sort of thing, instead of saying you do this, or you're bugging me because of this, you make me feel this or whatever, say, I feel this when you blank. And whatever you put into those blanks or those parts of that phrase, it's going to be much more effectively heard and responded to if you don't say you did this. And because of that, whatever. But if you say, I feel blank when you blank, just remember that key script. It sounds so basic, but boy, people have felt very free by just starting.
And honestly, if that's the only takeaway you get from today, it will be like 5 years of couples therapy in 20 minutes. So, it's brilliant. And I feel like I'm a good one to talk about this next one. Take a time out if you need it, because it's for those of us that our nervous systems kind of short circuit or are wired, that we've got a really low threshold for anything that feels like attack or I'm unhappy with you, or I'm disappointed, or I'm angry. And for those of us that, what Doug called earlier stonewalling, which is John Gottman, the idea is it's our responsibility to make sure that we are, if you think about it as like green zone of like, I could talk about this all day. I'm not triggered. I'm not activated. I love you. I'm here for it. Versus like yellow, which is like, I'm starting to bristle. I'm a little bit on the defensive. You better not say anything. That's going to really trigger me. That's where you need to watch out, because if it ever gets to red, and red looks like I'm lashing out, I'm really loud, I'm really angry, I'm on the offense, or it looks like walking away, right? So those are the same red nervous system responses. So this one is take a time out. If you're even inching towards red, I can promise you that conversation will not be productive. So how do you take responsibility to calm your nervous system so that you can show up and be a mature adult and be reasonable and express and not run away and not fight?
It's really tough to do, guys. But, I always tell people, listen to your bodies. If you find yourself not breathing very well, if you find yourself feeling flushed, if you find yourself sweating, if you find yourself just feeling tense and agitated, take a second. Like that is not going to be an effective place. And I usually use a scale of 1 to 10. And if you're not at a 4 or less, don't bother communicating at that moment. If you are
That's right.
triggered, if you're reactive, make sure that you take a moment and get yourself down to that level. And it can be a breathing exercise, like take 5 minutes outside. I really benefit from I seriously have walked outside and then walked back in really quickly.
It's so helpful.
Just to get a change of air and get a change of environment. Like I have seriously walked outside, maybe walked around my driveway a little bit and then walked inside and I was ready.
It's like a sensory wake up.
So it can be fast. It can be not fast. I do the recovery fast. I think everyone can be different about how we do this. So just know yourself and really, really, again, listen to your body. I will tell you again, 9 times out of 10, I'll have couples that are fighting in my office and sometimes really, really loud. And I'll say, take a deep breath because they're not breathing.
That's
I oftentimes will watch breathing in my office because breathing is a way to get your your nervous system down.
And I remember a million years ago, there was a John Gottman. He had done this experiment with couples where he was basically like, talk about your most heated argument. And he had them, of course, like he had all these, I don't know, what are they called? Electrodes, nodes, anal probes, something to test people's their heart rate and just, what am I trying to say? Parasympathetic nerve, I don't know, responses, their nervous system responses. And then the part of the experiment was, oh, shoot, the electronic, like whatever, there's been a short circuit, it's not working. Like, hold your thought right there. I know you were in the middle of a really important argument. Hold on right there. We just have to fix this, issue with our system really quickly. And then if it took even like 2 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever it was, no couple was able to reach that same level of anger and rage and heated responses. So, but I will say one thing that you said that was like my favorite, another really important takeaway, what Doug said is if you're the one that is shutting down, you are responsible to say, I need 5 minutes. But also I think that we should be able to ask our partner, like, this is getting too heated. Can we take 5?
Yeah. And, guys, it's not just 5 sometimes. I do have people who have needed a day. I have people who needed an hour. I have people who need 8 hours. Like, I think what you'll know is when you're ready. And it kind of, speaks to listening to yourself and making sure that you're ready to respond versus react in that debate or that argument, which, by the way, brings us to the next part, which is to own your part of something. And, we have this phrase, it takes 2 to tango. I can't even tell you, that there would never be a time that I don't think that's the case.
Right.
I think there's a dynamic between 2 people for sure, always. And owning your part is an important part of that. And sometimes taking a step away and then coming back. And I've done this many times. Like, I'll come back the next day and say, so I think I was wrong about this. Like, I think I over exaggerated, or I have new insight in this. Right.
I love it.
Which I did recently. And it was like, holy shit. I think I was totally, and my friend who confronted me on something was actually right about what was going on.
Wait, are you talking about
no,
because I'm always right about what's going on. Oh, wait, own my own stuff.
I need 5 minutes. Actually, I don't. Of course, that's humorous because we're never always
right. Our last one, and also I want to give a shout out. Like, this is from Psychology Today. These are just amazing talking points from this great article about fighting fair. So thank you, John Kim. We love it. And the last one is look for solutions and not scapegoats. Like, don't be looking for someone to blame. I also have been guilty of this in the past because it goes along with really needing to be right or really needing to be the one who is on a higher moral standing. Oh yeah, well you, or like, I wouldn't have done this if you didn't do that. Ooh, ew, don't do it.
So I hope that's helpful, guys. Inevitably, again, fighting or arguing or having disagreements is part of any relationship. And, one of the things I'll say about us is that when this started, my older daughter had kind of commented like, okay, you two are kind of going to be in this relationship now where you got to make sure you're healthy and you probably need to get a therapist and all that sort of thing. And we laughed at it initially.
I know.
But we have had our moments, right?
Like the honeymoon was over and we've worked through so many hard things. This seems like it's like a marriage, except without the sex.
You're not having?
Were you waiting till we got married?
No,
Did you think that was on the
We haven't
horizon
been
for us?
having it.
In your dreams. We love you guys. I know you can find us. Did you know that we're on social media?
I
What?
barely know that. But
Doug has been barely on social media. So find us on TikTok. I think it's We're Not Fine Pod, or maybe it's We're Not Fine. And then YouTube, I swear, that's where you need to go and subscribe and like and send us to all of your friends and your enemies. We love a good enemy share.
and we have a great TikTok person who
Dig.
I don't even know how it works, but sometimes I just look at our own videos and I laugh.
She's young and sharp and funny, and she like takes funny moments from our videos and puts them on TikTok.
Not to say that olds can't do it too, but
Are we olds? I'd like to rebrand that, please. Instagram, Dr. Talia Jackson and Douglas L. Jensen, and We're Not Fine Pod.
and go to we'renotfine.com where you can submit any questions to us, any comments about this or other episodes.
Please
We would
do.
love to hear from you, and you can be anonymous. You can put your name. We'd love to hear from you about that.
We love y'all. Happy New Year.
Take care of yourself. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.